In 1977, a charismatic former Seventh-day Adventist named Roch Thériault convinced 8 families to abandon their lives in Quebec and follow him into the wilderness. He called himself Moses. He promised salvation from the apocalypse he predicted would arrive in February 1979. His followers called their community the Ant Hill Kids, named after their philosophy of collective work and absolute obedience. By 1989, Thériault had performed amateur surgery on his followers without anesthesia. He had amputated limbs. He had removed teeth with pliers. He had opened abdomens with a knife, and one of his followers was dead. This is the story of the most disturbing cult in modern history, and what makes it worse is how long it went on while authorities did nothing. Roch Thériault was born in 1947 in rural Quebec. His father was strict, his mother was devout. By his 20s, Thériault had joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church and become obsessed with apocalyptic prophecy. He was smart, articulate, and magnetic. People listened when he spoke. In 1977, after being excommunicated from the church for his increasingly extreme interpretations of Scripture, Thériault started his own group. He called it the Ant Hill Kids because he taught that humans should work like ants in a colony. Individual identity meant nothing. The collective was everything, and he was the queen. He convinced 8 families to sell everything they owned and moved to a remote commune in the Gaspésie region of Quebec. They built cabins, they grew vegetables, they prepared for the end of the world Thériault predicted would come on February 17, 1979. The prophecy failed. February 17th came and went. The world didn't end. But instead of losing followers, Thériault's control deepened. He had an explanation ready. The apocalypse was delayed, he said, because they weren't pure enough. They needed more discipline, more sacrifice, more suffering. And that's when things got dark. Thériault began implementing brutal punishments for minor infractions. Forgot to say grace before a meal? That's a beating. Questioned his authority? That's a beating with a board embedded with nails. Made eye contact without permission? That's pliers to your teeth. He called these punishments surgery. He said he was removing the sin from their bodies, and incredibly, his followers accepted this explanation. They had given up everything to follow him. Admitting they were wrong meant admitting they had destroyed their lives for nothing. But this was just the beginning. In 1978, Thériault moved the group even deeper into isolation. They relocated to a more remote area near Burnt River, Ontario. No roads led to the compound, no phone lines. The nearest town was hours away on foot. The children in the group stopped attending school. The adults stopped having contact with their families. Thériault declared himself God, not a prophet, not a messenger, God himself. He changed his name legally to Moïse, the French spelling of Moses. He required his followers to call him master or father. He took multiple wives. Eventually, he had fathered 26 children within the commune. The daily routine became increasingly bizarre and abusive. Thériault would wake his followers at random hours for religious ceremonies that lasted all night. He forced them to perform in plays he wrote, where they acted out biblical stories with himself as God. He made them drink his urine, calling it holy water. He made them eat their own feces, calling it communion. Yeah, you read that right. The punishments escalated. Thériault began using surgery as his primary form of control. And here's the thing, he had zero medical training, none. But he had read books on anatomy and convinced himself he was a healer. In 1983, a follower named Gabrielle Lavallee had a minor workplace accident and injured her hand. Thériault decided her finger was infected. Instead of taking her to a hospital, he amputated her finger himself using a pair of wire cutters. No anesthesia, no sterile equipment, just wire cutters. Gabrielle survived, and that convinced Thériault he had surgical skills. Over the next several years, Thériault performed increasingly invasive procedures on his followers. He extracted teeth with pliers. He performed enemas using homemade equipment that caused internal injuries. He operated on abdomens, claiming he could remove tumors in diseased organs. In 1987, a woman named Solange Boillard complained of stomach pain. Thériault diagnosed her with an intestinal blockage. He decided to operate immediately. He laid her on a table in one of the cabins. He gave her olive oil to drink, claiming it was an anesthetic. Then he cut her abdomen open with a kitchen knife. He reached inside her body and began pulling out sections of her intestine. He cut away parts he believed were blocked. He used no sutures. Instead, he had another follower hold her abdomen closed while he stapled the wound shut with a staple gun, the kind you use for carpentry. Solange went into shock. She was dying. For a brief moment, Thériault panicked. He allowed his followers to call an ambulance. Solange was rushed to a hospital in critical condition. She died the next day from septic shock and massive internal bleeding. Police investigated. They arrested Thériault. But here's what's crazy. Most of his followers defended him. They testified that Solange had begged for the surgery. They said Thériault was trying to save her life. They said he was a healer. Thériault was convicted of manslaughter, but the sentence was light, just 2 years. The judge called it a tragic accident caused by religious delusion rather than malicious intent. In 1989, after serving his sentence, Thériault returned to the commune, and somehow, most of his followers took him back. Think about that for a second. This man had killed one of their friends with amateur surgery. He had been convicted and imprisoned, and they welcomed him back. The abuse resumed immediately, but now Thériault was more paranoid. He believed some of his followers might betray him. He needed total control, and that's when he decided to perform what he called preventive surgery. In 1989, Thériault became obsessed with the idea that Gabrielle Lavallee, the woman whose finger he had already amputated, was diseased. He told her she had cancer in her arm. She didn't, but he convinced her that he needed to amputate it to save her life. He laid her on the same table where Solange had died. He gave her a few shots of whiskey and told her to bite down on a leather strap. Then he used a meat cleaver and a saw to remove her arm at the shoulder. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, no sterile environment, just a meat cleaver, a saw, and a man who believed he was God. Gabrielle survived, barely. The wound became infected. For weeks, she lay in a cabin in agony while Thériault tried to treat the infection with his homemade remedies. Other followers were forced to care for her while continuing their regular work duties. But the surgery wasn't about healing. It was about power. Thériault had mutilated Gabrielle in the most visible way possible. Every time the other followers looked at her, they saw what happened when you let him operate on you. It was a warning. And that's when Gabrielle decided she'd had enough. In 1989, after months of recovery, Gabrielle Lavallee managed to escape. She waited until Thériault and most of the others were working in the fields. She walked through the forest for hours until she reached a road. She flagged down a car. She was taken to a hospital. When doctors examined her, they found evidence of multiple surgeries. Her missing arm, her missing finger, scars across her abdomen, internal injuries from the enemas, broken bones that had healed incorrectly, teeth that had been extracted with pliers, leaving infected sockets. She told them everything. The beatings, the surgeries, the children being abused, Solange's death. And this time, police took it seriously. In 1989, police raided the commune. They found Thériault and 12 adults living in squalor. Children were malnourished. The living conditions were medieval. Medical equipment was stored in cabinets alongside rotting food. Surgical tools had never been sterilized. Thériault was arrested and charged with aggravated assault on Gabrielle Lavallee. During the trial, the full extent of his abuse was revealed. Witnesses testified about the surgeries, the mutilations, the forced rituals. The prosecution presented medical evidence of the injuries he had inflicted. In 1993, Thériault was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The judge called him one of the most dangerous offenders in Canadian history. His followers were finally free. But here's the question nobody could answer. How did this go on for over a decade? How did authorities miss this? The truth is, they didn't miss it. They knew. Between 1977 and 1989, social services received multiple reports about the commune. Neighbors reported seeing malnourished children. Former members reported the abuse. But every time authorities investigated, they found the same thing. The adults insisted they were there voluntarily. The children, when interviewed, had been coached to say everything was fine. And because the adults were technically consenting, and because religious freedom is protected under Canadian law, authorities felt their hands were tied. As long as nobody filed a formal complaint from inside the group, there was little they could do. It took someone losing an arm before the legal system finally acted. After Thériault's conviction, psychologists studied the case extensively. They wanted to understand how intelligent, functional adults could submit to this level of abuse. How could people watch their friends be mutilated and not rebel? The answer comes down to gradual escalation and isolation. Thériault didn't start with surgery. He started with minor demands. Give up your possessions. Move to the wilderness. Follow my rules. Each demand was slightly larger than the last. By the time he was performing amputations, his followers had already accepted so much that they couldn't see how far they'd fallen. The isolation was key. Cut off from friends, family, and normal society, the commune became their entire world. Thériault was their only source of information, their only authority figure, their only connection to meaning and purpose. Leaving meant admitting they had wasted years of their lives. It meant facing the shame of having abandoned their families for a man who tortured them. So they stayed. They rationalized. They told themselves the suffering had meaning. They convinced themselves that Thériault's violence was love, that his torture was healing, that his insanity was divinity. The children who grew up in the Ant Hill Kids compound faced their own trauma. Many had witnessed the surgeries. Some had been victims themselves. They had received little education. They had been taught that the outside world was evil and that their father, Moïse, was God. After the commune was shut down, these children were placed in foster care or with relatives. Most struggled to adapt to normal society. Some required years of therapy. A few never fully recovered. Gabrielle Lavallee, the woman who escaped and brought down the cult, wrote a book about her experience called L'Alliance de la Brebis, The Alliance of the Sheep, published in 1993. She detailed the daily abuse, the psychological manipulation, and the moment she finally decided she would rather die trying to escape than live one more day under Thériault's control. She testified that the hardest part wasn't the physical pain. It was the realization that she had wasted 12 years of her life believing a lie. She had given up her children's childhoods. She had watched her friends be tortured, and she had done nothing because she believed it was God's will. Sound crazy? Here's the thing. Cults like this happen more often than you think. The Ant Hill Kids weren't unique in their structure or methods. What made them unique was the extent of the physical violence and the fact that it was eventually stopped. Thousands of similar groups operate right now. Most don't perform amateur surgery, but they use the same techniques. Isolation, gradual escalation, charismatic authority, punishment disguised as love. And most of them never make the news because the victims never escape, or because they escape too damaged to speak about it. Roch Thériault remained in prison for the rest of his life. In 2011, he was murdered by his cellmate, a man named Matthew Gerard MacDonald, who stabbed him in the neck with a homemade shank. Thériault bled out in his cell. He was 63 years old. Some of his former followers expressed grief at his death. Even after everything, even after decades of freedom and therapy, they still felt a connection to the man who had tortured them. That's how deep the psychological control went. The Ant Hill Kids commune site was abandoned after the raid. The cabins fell into disrepair. Nature reclaimed the clearing. Today, if you know where to look, you can still find the foundations of the buildings in the Ontario wilderness. Local hikers occasionally stumble upon the ruins and leave without realizing what happened there. There's no memorial, no marker, nothing to indicate that this was the site of one of the most disturbing cults in modern history. The forest has swallowed the evidence. The survivors have tried to move on. Most have changed their names. Some have reconnected with the families they abandoned. Others have never spoken publicly about their experience. A few have spent years in therapy trying to rebuild their sense of identity after spending their formative years being told they were nothing more than worker ants serving a malevolent queen. The children, now adults, have had varied outcomes. Some have managed to build normal lives. They have families and careers. They've learned to contextualize their childhood as something that happened to them, not something that defines them. Others haven't been so fortunate. The trauma of watching your parent be mutilated, of being told that torture is love, of being raised to believe your father is God and then discovering he's a monster, that kind of damage doesn't always heal. The question that haunts researchers who study this case is whether it could happen again. And the answer, unfortunately, is yes. The mechanisms that allowed the anthill kids to exist are still in place. Religious freedom laws protect even extreme groups from intervention. Isolated communities can operate for years without outside contact, and human psychology hasn't changed. People are still vulnerable to charismatic leaders who promise certainty in an uncertain world. The only real defense is awareness, understanding how these groups operate, recognizing the warning signs, gradual isolation from family and friends, increasing financial dependence on a leader, punishment for questioning authority, escalating demands that seem small individually but massive in total. And if you notice these patterns in someone you care about, speak up. Not with judgment, but with concern. Because the longer someone stays in a high-control group, the harder it becomes to leave. The sunk cost becomes overwhelming. The shame becomes paralyzing. The legacy of the Anthill Kids is a reminder that evil doesn't always look like evil. Roch Thériault didn't seem like a monster to his followers. He seemed like a prophet. He seemed like a healer. He seemed like someone who had answers to questions they couldn't solve alone. And that's what made him so dangerous. Not his capacity for violence, but his capacity to make violence seem like salvation. In the end, the Anthill Kids fell apart not because of outside intervention, but because one woman decided that living without an arm was better than living under Thériault's control. Gabrielle Lavallee's escape was an act of profound courage. She knew she might die trying to reach help. She walked through the forest severely injured, knowing that if she collapsed, she would likely be found by Thériault's followers and brought back. But she walked anyway, and that walk saved the lives of everyone left behind. Today, Gabrielle lives privately, somewhere in Quebec. She rarely gives interviews. She wrote her book, gave her testimony, and then tried to reclaim her anonymity. She lost an arm, 12 years of her life, and nearly her sanity. But she got out. The others who stayed until the end still carry the scars. Some are physical, missing fingers, damaged organs, broken bones that healed wrong. But most of the scars are invisible, the kind that make you question your own judgment for the rest of your life. The kind that make you wonder how you could have been so wrong about someone you trusted completely. The Anthill Kids are gone. The compound is ruins. Thériault is dead. But the story remains as a warning about the human capacity for both manipulation and submission, about how easily we can lose ourselves when we're desperate for meaning, and about how much courage it takes to admit we've been wrong and walk away from everything we've invested in a lie. If this story disturbed you, good. It should. These things happened. They happened in Canada in the 1980s, not in some distant historical period. They happened because people looked the other way, because laws protected abusers in the name of religious freedom, and because victims stayed silent until they physically couldn't anymore. Remember the Anthill Kids. Remember what happened when charisma replaced reality, when faith replaced reason, and when silence replaced action. If you found this video informative, consider sharing it. Stories like this need to be told. And if you want more deep dives into dark history, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching.